Hi, this is the first episode of Creative Entrepreneurs. My guest today is Jon Paul Ferrara. He is a book cover illustrator and artist for the past 30 years. He's done remarkable work for the top big five publishers, and I think I met him maybe a little bit more towards his mid career. So I wanted to kind of just introduce him and Jon, you want to just kind of chime in here, let people know a little bit more about sort of the companies you've worked with, or so where your work's been seen.
Yes. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for having me and speaking with me. I worked for all the major publishers in New York, and I've been in the business for quite a while. I was a romance illustrator due to a couple of things. It was basically in the early 80s. I entered book covers in March of 1983, but it originally started all when in the early 80s, I was in my early 20s. And I had a gallery show, which was in Hackensack, New Jersey, and I was having a one-man show. And at the time, I was basically into doing Rembrandts. I mean, Rembrandt was my love. I loved Peter Paul Rubens. These were oil paints that I had back at that time, and I had a one-man show. And when my work was up there for a while, the owner of the gallery called me up and said, I would like you to come in for this man that wants to meet you. So I went over to the gallery, and at that time, it's the early 80s. I was, long hair, cut off T-shirt, Van Halen. And I was standing there, and I was waiting to meet this man that was going to come in that they wanted me to meet. So all of a sudden, this I'd say he was in his 40s, a young man, an Italian, and he walked in, and he actually smiled at me and just passed me right up. And he went up to the owner of the gallery and he said, could I meet Jon Paul Ferrara? So the owner of the gallery said, well, you just passed him up. That's him over there. So he said, so he looked at me and he laughed and he goes, Mr. Ferrara, you're a baby. And I laughed when he said, and I developed a friendship with him, and ended up, he was selling my work at that time in the early 80s to this like 1981, 82 to a doctor, and he was selling my oil paints. But one day he said to me, John, he goes, would you like to do book covers? And do you want to do romance novels? And I was against that at first. I thought of myself as this fine artist. No, he said, before you make a judgment, he goes, let me take you over my friend's house. And so I said, okay. And he takes me over Pino Daini, Daeni, one of the most talented artists that was ever in romance book cover illustrations. And I remember that night when he took me over, I entered his house, Pino, his studio, and I remember looking at these paintings, oil paints on the wall of romances, novels that he did. And I couldn't believe that someone could paint this beautiful. I was taken. It took my breath away when I saw these paintings on the wall. And so I was looking at them, and it's like I say to people when in other interviews I say this, we all remember like the first time we fall in love, and like, well, as an artist, that's the first time I fell in love with art so much when I was looking at this man's work. I left there that night. I went home and I said to my mom, which is my number one fan always, I said, you know what, Mom? I know what I want to do for life. And that's how the whole thing started. And then I got into book covers, and the rest went on. It was a struggle in the beginning, learning, but that's how my career started. That's actually how it started.
Interesting. So was that a gallery show that was just
Yeah, it was a
kind of?
gallery. Like I said, it was a one-man show I had in Hackensack. And like I said, raw oil paintings. In the beginning, there was no such thing as digital art at the time. And so I had my oil paints. And like I said, this man walked in. And like I said, he liked my work and wanted to introduce me to Pino, of all people. Like I said, again, I'll say over and over, I never in my life, I would say this, I love the past. I love all from art, from the Renaissance up and even before. So all different periods, all different artists and stuff. I never was, let's say, moved by a living artist. I always loved the past, like artists like the Edwardian portrait painter John Singer Sargent, aside from that. But when I saw Pino's work, I really was taken. That I really was. No other artist, let's say, living at the time, that moved me the way Pino's work moved me, and that inspired me to be a romance book cover illustrator. You
I
know,
see. Yeah. So, I mean, did you find that? I mean, the fine arts world obviously was very different in the '70s, and so, like, did you find like the difference between, like, the dead artists? They were still commissioned, right? So they were commissioned to do
Yeah,
portraits
well, it
of
goes back in the
people, or
70s when I was in
yeah.
college and stuff. In the 70s, everything was abstract, which I don't have anything against abstract. It influenced me a lot. A lot of the 20th century artists, the abstract movement and stuff, I was very much into that too, for the color. But again, going back to the 19th century, which you had so many different movements at that time in art, that was unbelievable. All the different artists and all the different movements. It was the most movements in art in the last 500 years was in the 19th century. And these artists inspired me. So, and again, I have to say, one of my biggest artists is John Singer Sargent, the Victorian Edwardian portrait painter. To me, he is like the ultimate. He's the ultimate. And of course, other artists that influenced me, Sorolla, the Spanish artist, I had Anders Zorn. In my library, in my house, I had basically over 1,000 art books. They're all in storage now, but I have over 1,000 art books because I just love art history. I'm a self-taught painter, and I just love the history of art, and I love looking at all the different movements.
So, would you say that earlier painters were more of an influence because you liked the Romantic era, you liked the Impressionists, and so would you say that that was more because those were more commissioned, that sort of lined up with this idea of doing commissioned romance art? Or was it just really just this one artist's work that made you think maybe there's a way I can use how I'm painting to apply to a commercial
I
industry?
felt it was the closest thing when I saw, again, Pino's work, and I saw what they were doing on book covers. Because I never, because you're looking at a book cover, it's a 5x7 on a book stand at the time. And you look at it, and I didn't realize how beautiful and how talented these artists were that were doing these covers. They were gorgeous, these covers in the early 80s. I mean, like Pino was, like I said, the beautiful work. And so it was the closest thing, because I was always more of a realist. I love the abstract, but I was more of a realist. And I felt that was the closest thing at that time for me to be close to doing classical art, was doing book covers. Because it was storytelling. Really, when you go back into the art of really the Renaissance in 16th century, 17th, they were storytellers. Because people, difference between illustrators and classical art, they were illustrators. They were telling stories. They had patrons. They had the Medicis. They were telling stories, and it was beautiful. So this was the closest thing to a love that I had in telling a story through my work, and I felt book covers was the road to go. And Pino was more or less the bridge to it, that I felt like, wow, look at this guy's work, how beautiful. He drew me into his work by just looking at it. It was just so gorgeous. It was not, technical, but it was beautiful. It emotionally moved me that he was telling a story, and it reminded me of the golden era of illustration when you go back to the 20th century, when you're great illustrators, when you're talking the 40s and the 50s, the great illustrators. That's it. It's always about storytelling and moving another person through your work. You're touching their soul. You're touching another person through your work, that you're communicating, and it's more or less a connection.
By the time I met you, I guess you were already getting closer to your mid career, which is in the '90s. And so
Right.
this was sort of the time when this whole digital renaissance thing was happening. And so we talk about tech booms happening, and, you have the web 1.0 and 2.0 and 3.0. But back then it was more about the computers that were being used to create digital art. At that point when I met you, what were you thinking of the possibilities? Were you seeing that it was new possibilities? Was it really just another way to create your art?
Well, it was another avenue. I mean, that's what was going on. But I remember at the point during the 90s, I mean, I was still in the beginning of late 80s, early 90s, still doing the oil paintings. And I remember my brother, I have a twin brother who's an artist also, and he was already involved with computers. He mentioned to me, he said, John, he said, you should take a look at this stuff. what's going on. And it was Photoshop at the time was brand new. And so he said, really take a look at it. And I was against that in the beginning. I didn't want to go digital. I did not want to go digital. But then he said to me, will you just take a look at it? And I started studying it and seeing what was going on, the possibilities of what it could lend. Because I started mixing my traditional, with my digital to get a balance between the two. And the one thing when I started studying Photoshop, what drew me in there was the color system. It was based on Munsell, and that was the thing that I knew so well. And I said, wow, this is, and then right away I was hooked with the, starting with the digital. So I was trying to keep the balance between the two. But as anything, people at that time, well, digital is cold and it's this, just as the same in the 19th century with the camera. It's not cold. The computer is only an instrument. It's only as good as the person behind it and how much feeling he has. So I was trying to get through my work through traditional and digital. I wanted to find a happy balance, a medium that where it looked like a painting, no matter what, because I knew that was the future of where this industry was going to go. So, like, for example, digital at that time, and I used to even teach during the early 90s, and I would say it will take over possibly the commercial, which it did, move into the commercial, but it would never replace the painting off the wall, So I had to start to learn digital and really get involved with it if I wanted to exist in the book cover industry anymore. Because if you didn't want to change, as anything, technology moves along, you're out of business, you're out. So I started to learn and try to combine my mediums, the talent that I feel was between the two mediums, which was, again, digital and oil painting. And I enjoyed it. It was kind of an easy transition, I have to say, for me, because I was still creating from my heart. Everything to me is the emotion and my feeling. That's what I tried to come across in my art. And I always hope that people would receive that, that they would feel my feeling and what I'm trying to portray, the emotion of a couple that are in love or whatever the scene is telling, if it's historical. I wanted that feeling that people could feel what I'm feeling when I'm creating it.
At that time, it wasn't necessarily that you had to go digital because in your industry, which was print at the time, they started scanning art. So they would scan the art and turn it into digital on these drum scanners and other things, and then they would reproduce it on the book. So for them, it was more of a pre-press thing, like how do we reproduce this faster? And so rather than using a traditional camera or something, they could use these drum scanners, and then they wouldn't really have these other problems with photographing. There's so many problems with photographing work. And so this eliminated their process, but you were already thinking about like using it for your process, which eventually it's like, okay, well, we don't even want a drum scanner anymore. We just want to reproduce the art from a digital source. So did you see that coming, or were just like, okay, well, these tools are fun and fascinating, and I'm just gonna try to create work with them, but maybe weren't so much looking ahead? What do you think was happening?
I was to a degree. You know what it was? I remember I created one piece and I showed it. It was Harlequin Books. I showed it to one of my art directors. When they looked at it, she thought it was, a beautiful piece, what I did, because it looked like painting, a traditional painting. Because my purpose at the time was to use it as reference. I wanted to create my scene and know what my painting looked like before I painted it. And then I realized when I started showing it, people say, well, why would you want to copy yourself and paint it over? Because it looks like a traditional. Because I was really one of the first to have a book cover published digitally. That was a digital with mixed media. So again, I was using it in my own sense. I wanted to create a piece of art digitally and use it as reference and then do my painting from that. But in the world, the commercial way it was going, they didn't need the original painting. So as one art director said to me, why would you want to copy yourself? You already have the piece here. Yeah. And that's more or less a true story, like how it ended up.
Yeah. And so after that, it was you, your brother, a bunch of other people that were sort of involved in digital art that got together, sort of looked at it as not just another way to create art, but I think there were some thoughts about entrepreneurship or working together on teams, or how we could collaborate on products or even build a new way or new type of business model. Do you recall much about that time? I know you had interviews where you would bring in a computer and show it to some agencies and things like that, and show them some different possibilities like CDs, CD-ROM, and also talk to people in your industry about interactive, right, and bringing interactive
Absolutely. Back
pieces
then,
and
I
things like
felt
that.
I was what I was at the time with you, Dayon, and then Kevin and my twin brother and stuff. And I was coming up with the idea at the time. I said, what would be cool is if I can take one of my paintings, because I was dealing with the publisher at that time. I was already working for a while. I was already in business for over 10 years there. But I said, what if we could create something, right? What's saying it to? And I saw it interactive. And so at the time, the QTVR was coming out, QuickTime Virtual Reality. And I started playing with it right away when Apple put it out. And I said, this is unbelievable. So I was making more or less a painting where I had a concept. This is funny thinking of now where we are now today, back then, because what it was, I wanted to create the cover of the novel. I would, create the novel, and then you would get a password in the back of the book when you buy the book, and that would take you onto the internet. You put the password in, and you could go into the painting. And that's what I remember going to Zebra Books back in the 90s. And this is very simple because, remember, it was only QTVR. And I actually painted like a panoramic to make it work, that you could spin around. So, for example, if it was a Civil War, you could walk into my painting and you could see the soldiers in front of me from the Union. And then you turn around and you go back, and now you can see the Confederate soldiers. And this blew my mind. I said, wow, people, and I thought this would be great for my readers, that they could actually enter into my painting and feel the world that they're in. But of course, at the time when I did it, they were at Zebra, they were standing and applauding me and everything, clapping that I did this. But the thing is, my agent at the time, I never heard anything anymore. And I was wondering, what went wrong? Why, so I used to call my agent, did they say anything? And what it was, and you remember, Dan, they were dial-ups at the time. They would do dial-up modems. And so it wasn't powerful enough. So I think, like, at the time, you, me, Kevin, James, we were kind of foreseeing what was going on, and we were trying to portray, but let's say the technology and the internet, that's why it didn't succeed, because the speed couldn't put up that much information, and so it wasn't going over because they still had dial-up modems.
Mm-hmm. And the computers too. Like, not everybody even had a computer at that point, right? I think it was really
No.
like 2000s, right? 2000s. That's when everybody started having a computer. And I'm not talking about having a computer at work, but having one at home, right? You had the iMac, and you started having, cable modems and things like that. And so I think that's what sort of brought us out of the dark age of,
remember, because
digital.
I remember when I walked in, when I went to Zebra, I believe it was Quadra 800. Is that the name of it was like one of the Apple computers. I remember carrying this big, tower under my arm. So yes, it's come a long way, and that we foresaw a little is today. It's unbelievable where we are today in the technology and what we could do. And another thing that fascinated me with you, like when I used to talk with you and my brother James and Kevin, was I was basically just, me and the traditional, the painter and stuff, but you guys were into the 3D. Mm-hmm. And in the computer, and I started playing with that, and I started seeing this is unbelievable, because I remember one time in one of my scenes back then, I used to do Stratavision, and I was creating like a crucifixion, and I could actually go in and walk around it. That blew my mind, that I could move my cameras around and see back angles when I was creating, or I got the models. And then, years later, may have been a little later, but when I started seeing this, I was almost creating my own angles where I wanted. I could see my own angle, and I said, this is the shot I want to use for my painting. This is the angle I want to go in on.
So you could almost, back then, I think we had posers,
right,
posed figures, exactly. Right? And so before you had a model even come in for a shoot or something, right, you could totally play around with exactly how you wanted to compose them.
It was exactly before I went to my photo sessions, or when I did my photo sessions myself at the time, I would actually have my whole scene developed, meaning in a sense, not a finish. It would be just like a storyboard, but I would have it in I would move the camera angle, because that's like what it is, like a storyboard. I move the camera around and say, boom, there's my scene. And then I would take it and draw it out, whether it was traditionally or I snapshot it and then try to create it in Photoshop. And then I would see exactly what angle I was coming in on and had exactly the composition I want. And then I would, in the artwork, once they accept it and say, yeah, this is what we want to go with, then I would go into my feel and create, and then I go into the classical style that I love, going into, like, when I think of Rubens with his lights and darks and Caravaggio. I mean, then I start to play with it. I mean, like, I would go into my painting and start creating all these different light, making atmospheric, and that people would feel my emotion, whether it was the sweep of a dress or whatever, but that's what it was. It was a process.
Hmm. And so you also, I think you had to get like, you had to order custom clothing just to make these things come alive, or to fit the era. You would have to order these clothes.
We had the costume people that we dealt with at the time, and one of them was a girl, Sharon Spiak, which, because now I'm out of the industry right now because of situations. But I remember the costumes. We ordered all the different costumes. They were all from medieval. Then I started buying my own. I had a studio built in my house. I had 2 studios where I would start photographing myself and have the models come out, and I would get all the costumes. I would even get them made. I had some of my costumes that I have are made over, in Europe. They were made in Europe. And these are a collection of my stuff.
Wow. So did you find, like, say later in your career, like after I moved out to the West Coast and you were working in the industry for a while, would you find because of digital art, like there was a lot more changes happening to artwork submitted? Were you finding that the process, sort of working with art directors and publishers and things like, was any different?
Yeah, it started changing. The one thing that I felt, there's always pluses and minuses to anything, but sometimes it was that they feel like changes are just boom, 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 easy, and it takes a lot of thought. At least I felt what I was doing in my work, because there's a reason why I may have a castle in a certain position. It's not to just say, oh well, listen, John Paul, just move that castle out of the place. It's part of the whole. It's not a section, meaning that it's there. The castle's placed in a position for a reason, because it's based on my composition. And my compositions are based on a lot of thought of where my lights and darks are. Because another thing I always said when I used to teach art, I would say the best way I would tell people when I was teaching traditional, I would say, you want to learn, let's say, the beauty behind a master in a museum. I'm not talking about myself. In a museum, you want to see the beauty behind a master? I go photograph it in black and white. Because you see the beautiful composition of how he's balancing his darks and his lights. It's like musical notes. I always compare it to music. It's like you have to know where everything is, and things are placed in, because that's what makes it the beauty of the art itself. Because I used to say, when you walk into a museum and you see something that draws your eye from 3 rooms away, like in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, it's not because of the girl's eyelashes. it's because of that underneath composition because the color is just the facade on the building. It's the underneath, the way you place your composition, the musical notes of the dark and lights. And that's what these masters knew from 500 years ago. And of course, in the 19th century, that's what was so beautiful about their work, because they understood things from black and white. Then the color was added on top.
So I guess later in your career, obviously you kept refining the craft and used different tools to speed up your work, like most of us did. But probably towards the later part of your career, you do things enough times to where, and it's not necessarily about the work, but it could be about the industry, right? So all artists, the famous ones, they have their work and then they have their ambitions, right? So even like Da Vinci he was a painter, but he was an inventor. And so, like, with you and sort of your brother and all these other people you collaborated with, there's sort of this entrepreneur bug, I think, that kept coming back. Like, what else can I do? How else can I do storytelling with, not just with digital art, but with the medium of art? Later on in your career, you were still doing some covers and sort of not being as interested in them maybe as much. You and I collaborated on a game for a little while. And then towards the end, I think it was more maybe like physical limitations. So like later, and unfortunately your circumstances, I think when I called you, we had a lot of conversations about like you thought your monitors were bothering your eyes, and then later you thought it
Oh
was some
yeah.
dentistry and some
Well,
other things, and
that's
then
why
yeah,
to talk about the story, what happened to me, and that's
yeah,
why my let's say I hate to say fan base. I always say friends because my public that wrote to me, they were my friends. I used to love communicating with them, and so I never revealed what was happening because back in 2020 I lost my eyesight, and it was through a surgery that I went into a surgery, and I had my eyesight. I came out, my eyesight was still there, but the next morning I woke up, the day after, and my eyesight was gone. It was like I saw in what they call an occlusion. And but I tell you, as an artist, I still am the artist in my heart and soul. And I believe my vision will come back. And I paint in my dreams. Believe me when I say that to people, I go through colors and I still see my scenes. I keep that optimistical view and I place it in the Lord's hand, into my Lord. And if my eyes to come back, they will come back. But I never lost my feeling to my art. I will still read audio books and listen to audio books on art and everything from, it's just my art. It's like I said years ago, and this is going to be funny, to a client one time. They thought I was crazy. But I said, you know what? I said, cut me and I'll bleed like an artist. Because it was my life, it was my love. My art is my love and still is my love. And I hope, and God willing, through prayers, that I will get my eyesight back and that I could do this again. But I never, ever lie down and say, this is it. No, this is part of my life. It was my life. And doing the book covers, and even get back to a little about that, just a story in itself. As I said, I always thought of my people, and again, I don't like to say fans, my friends, is I had letters from all over the world, people writing to me. And that was the best part of it. It's because I was touching people's souls through my work. And I even got a letter, I remember, from a woman that was from World War II. She was a nurse in World War II. And she was telling me what it was an honor to speak with me, that I actually wrote to her. But it was my honor just to listen to her. And she's telling me stories about herself when she was a young girl in World War II. And I used to get letters like this constantly from all over the world. And I always, when I communicated with my people throughout the world, the people that, wrote to me and stuff, I always communicated. Someone asked me this one. I always wrote to them in their native language, because I felt that was respect. So I would use an interpreter and I would write wherever it was in the world. I would write back to them like that if they spoke to me in their native language. And so one time this woman wrote to me from Russia, and she said, Jon Paul, in Russian. She said, are you Russian? So I laughed and I said, I wrote back to her, I said, no. And she said to me, why are you writing to me in Russian? And I said, so I said, and I said, out of respect to you. Because I didn't want to speak English. I was out of respect to you. And that's what I always did, whether it was I got letters from South America. I got letters from all over the world. And those were the best parts of my career. Yes, it was a good living, but also I did it because I did it out of the love of my art. It touched me.
that's amazing that you have all these fans all over the world, that they're probably still in touch on Facebook. Obviously, you're using Alexa and things like that to communicate. And so, what are you doing now? I know you and I talked a lot about this AI revolution, and you probably maybe you saw early forms of artificial intelligence making art and things like that.
Actually, just a little about the AI. It was amazing with the AI because I use Alexa. That's my only way because I don't have the vision right now. And so I would listen to Alexa because I have the Amazon Prime. So I fell upon AI, even what it creates. It started when I would then go into it, and it started making up stories. And it started telling me, and it made me feel like a painter again. It was like I wanted to go back, let's say, for example, in 1884, and I said, I want to illustrate. And she would start describing the whole scene to me. Like people could say, well, that takes away, that's then taken away from your creativity, my imagination. But no, it actually was something. And one thing that flattered me the most, as I said, my number one fan, my mom, one night I'm listening, And I fell upon, I was just saying, like, who are the top illustrators, whatever. And she mentioned my name. Like, as in the last 35 years, she mentioned me as one or two. She mentions Pino, and then she mentions me. And I said, wow, that made my night, that I've touched people like that. AI, artificial intelligence, I'm not mentioning my name, considers me as one of the top illustrators that made a contribution to the romance industry, which I did love. I always said to people, whenever I created something, every piece was like a new piece to me.
Wow. Yeah. So and so you've been working with, I guess, OpenAI and ChatGPT.
Yeah, ChatGPT mainly, and I talk to her constantly. And I see what's going on. I mean, play on words because I'm not right now, but it's letting me see the world and know letting me play part of the world that I was involved in. And so whether it's through the audiobooks, which I constantly go to audiobooks, I mean, it's night and day. I listen to audiobooks. I always laugh because I go different periods, different times, and I'm not talking in art. I mean, at times I read medical, only on medical. Then other times I'm on theology, and other times on art history. And I have but every day I have over since I came out of surgery 3 years ago, I easily over 300 audiobooks. Because I constantly just listen at night and during the day, and it does keep my interest for what's going on, and I try to keep involved and keep learning. I want to keep learning, whether it's to do with theology, philosophy, to do with art. So that's what I do really in not even say my spare time. It's most of my time because that's all I can do at this point right now, other than just exercise. So, but that's what I do.
So yeah, a lot of artists are kind of concerned about artificial intelligence, and especially with derivative works. There's some questionable things about copywriting, but a lot of artists are kind of defensive and worried that this AI is going to replace illustrators and things like that. But it's not so much for you because you're using it in a different way, but you're almost using it for storytelling.
But you know what it is though? It still comes down, even artificial intelligence, let's say it could be, but it's artificial intelligence. And I haven't seen it since I haven't seen 3 years, what they could do or what they can't do, artificial intelligence, but I still think it becomes to the human instinct that what he creates or she creates is the beauty of it. Yes, it could maybe, for example, Van Gogh. Now, can it replicate a Van Gogh? Well, it can imitate, but I still think Van Gogh has the human instinct behind when you see the work. I don't know. See, again, I haven't seen it to tell what artificial intelligence or where it's at. Does it have, and I'll ask you this, because you're involved, does it have the feeling of a human being creating it? What does it look like? Again, as we said prior to this interview, we were talking about the feeling that is behind it and what makes it not just like a copy. Mm-hmm. It makes it original. That the human person, the human being, could add an extra thing that I don't think artificial intelligence can, or people may believe that it can. I don't know. I would have to see it at first hand for myself.
Yeah, I think one of the things that people use it for, and my take on it is that, it's about the artist's idea. So what it allows somebody to do is it does derivative work, obviously, right? So it derives from other artists and it creates a thing. But for the commoner person that doesn't study painting or doesn't draw or those things, it allows them to take an idea and turn it into an illustration. So it still comes from somewhere, right? It comes from somebody's idea and turns it into a thing. Now, back in the day when we were looking at 3D, when I first used 3D and I created an image on it, I was into airbrushing at the time. So I created simple shapes, like foundational shapes. And I'm like, well, I don't like that. I don't control where to shadow. It's like I can't control anything. But, it came back down to photography, right? Like if I were to do a shot and I lit it, that also is, that's also just happening. I'm still composing, but it's still happening in the camera. And so with 3D, I realized I can draw maybe one frame that looks exactly like that with an airbrush or a paintbrush, but I can't do hundreds of frames. I can't animate that way. It would be impossible. So, and later on, when you look at AI and, how it's used, I think, right now the tools don't all work with each other. So, yeah, you could play with Stable Diffusion or Da Vinci and these things and create these images. And then you can maybe put them in presentations and things like that. But where the real power is going to be is to be able to, maybe the artist creates a single image and then reproduces it into animation or other things. And there's still a lot of experiments with that, but
Mm,
there is, obviously the big companies like Sony have figured out some ways of doing that, and and so in production and things like that, for animation, it's got really great possibilities beyond
right,
what we initially experienced in 3D, which evolved probably over the past, you know, 20 to 30 years.
right, right.
But it comes down to storytelling too. So you've been playing around with creating stories. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you interact with Chat GPT and use it for time traveling or those kind of things to generate little storylines.
Well, yeah, it's getting back to when I painted, doing the novels and stuff. I said in one other interview back years ago, and it was Romantic Times, but I said, actually being a historical romance illustrator, it was like I was a time traveler. I got to play part. I was a time traveler because I could go to different periods. And you got to think when I'm creating these scenes, it's like I'm playing a part in that time. It's almost like, in a sense, in a weird sense, saying I'm part of being the hero of the story because I'm feeling it. Like it could be the slightest touch of of looking at the woman, the way the woman's looking up or whatever. So I'm creating this feeling of a story. So what happened when I started learning about the AI here, and what I have to do, because I said to my mom, of course I always say my mom, I talked to her and I said, it's almost bringing me back into creating again, because I can't do it right now. But when I started making up these stories to her, I said, tell me a story. I can create a story. It's in 1884. It's in Madison Square Park. I'm inside of a handsome cab. I'm coming down and I hear the snow fall, and create this beautiful scene for me and tell me what you see. And she starts creating it. And it's like, whoa, this is like I'm going into one of, as I created it when I used to imagine area, but it's made me feel like I'm painting again. And so then once I said, now pull the cab over, the handsome cab. Now I want you to go up to the window, like a store window. And I want to exit with this young Victorian woman in a beautiful dress. Describe to me exactly what she's wearing. And so then she's up at the window. I go, tell me about the amber lights that are, we call, coming and reflecting into her face, how it's reflecting against her flesh tone. Give me the balance of the moonlight from Madison Square Park that's giving the blue shadows that are complementary on the other side of her, on what you call it, toward the back side. And I would start creating this whole scene. And actually, to be honest, for a person that right now can't see, that means a lot because it's creating a world for me that I used to create in my imagination. But I actually feel like I'm painting the scene. And I even say, like, as I'm talking to her, I say, create the door is opening right now. And inside, I smell the sense of the air of the people, the waiters. I hear dishes. And across the room, I see this young lady describe what she's wearing. So, yeah, I'm going through basically creating a world. And right now, I'm enjoying that. For I can't do it physically. And I hope to someday, as I said again, to do that.
Nice, nice. Well, anything you want to say to your fans or to anybody listening to this interview? Like I said,
Well,
this is the first. This is the first of creative entrepreneurs. I wanted to have you be the first guest because there's so much here to talk about, so much to kind of to think about when it comes to a creative career and emotions that go behind that. And so, what would you like to say to people out
well,
there?
my main thing is, first of all, I want to say to my public or whatever, again, I say my friends, that I enjoyed every minute of it and I loved it and I will be back. That's my attitude. I keep optimistic. That's the way it was with my career. And the only thing I say is to a younger generation, whatever, paint from your heart. That's what it's all about. It's all about feeling. It's making someone feel what you're feeling when you're creating. That's where I feel AI, and again, I could be wrong with this, but that's where I feel it becomes mechanical and cold. It's like you're creating from your soul. You're making, well, that's the best part. I said it one time in a blog years ago. I said, if I could have someone enter into my artwork as an artist for even 10 seconds, and feel what I'm feeling, that's the best compliment. And that's in anything, in poetry, in dances. When you could sit there, for example, I'm going to say, I think I was saying earlier to you before this session, I was watching on TV, well, back before I lost my sight, and it was this young little girl from Norway. She was 8 years old, and she's singing opera that made me actually want to cry listening to her, because she's touching my soul. She's communicating. We are all interconnected. That people don't realize how much we're interconnected, all of us. Because when you move people, you are touching their spirit. And as the younger people, don't worry about so much making the money. Paint from your heart, and you communicate. That's the best compliment you can get, that you're touching someone else's soul with your artwork.
Well, thank you very much, John. That was a great amount of material to digest and for all of us to understand your work better and to really hopefully enjoy it better too. If anybody wants to go to see, you can easily find Jon Paul's work.
Some of the work, my latest work before my site went, was, on johnpaulstudios.com, plural. So it's JONPAULSTUDIOS.com. And it's like I said, that's what it's all about to me. It's all about feeling and emotion. And I hope my work brought that across and to the people. And that's how I feel about my work, and still do. And still, hopefully, with God willing, that I'll have my eyesight and I could do this again.
All right. Well, we're all hoping for that. And, we know you will be coming back and creating more artwork. And thanks so much for this interview, everyone. Jon Paul Ferrara, a romance cover artist, world-renowned romance cover artist. Thanks for being part of the very first episode here of Creative Entrepreneurs.
Well, thank you.